I think that given that it's 2 o'clock, I'm just going to start and we're going to let Karen just get her slides. So firstly, can I thank absolutely everyone who's joined us here today. This, as I was saying earlier, it's very much a first for the Association for Journalism Education. Our conferences are usually our own members presenting their own research. And what we decided to do this time was to actually look at one of the biggest stories in town and go to some real experts in that. And I think we have gathered together a panel of real experts in this, people who have reported on this story, people who have written about this story. And I think we could say that while the pandemic certainly is the biggest story in town at the moment, I think it is probably sharing that dubious honour with the US presidential elections. So I would like to really warmly welcome our speakers to the Association for Journalism Education. The one upside of the pandemic has meant that this is in fact our third international conference, and we're welcoming speakers from the United States today and from the UK, because Ted is based at Lancaster University, albeit that he is from the United States. And we're welcoming colleagues and friends because we are very much a community here at the Association for Journalism Education from across the world. And we know that we have people zooming in from Canada, the United States, the UK, Europe. You know, we get someone zooming in from Berlin. So we very much have taken the opportunity that the pandemic has presented to enable us to share as widely as possible the work that our colleagues do and the really important work that journalism and journalism education is doing in our society. I would also really like to welcome lots of new faces today, particularly really want to welcome lots of the students who are here. This event was organised with you very much in mind. I was organising a lecture for my own students, where I coaxed one of our own professors at the University of the West of Scotland, who may be on this call, to come and speak to my students about the elections. And from that idea, I began to think I would quite like a panel. And so that gave me the idea, let's do something that we can share with everyone. So this event was very much designed with our students in mind, and it's so delightful to see so many of them here today, and I hope they find this useful. I hope it informs some of the work that they're doing, maybe it informs some of their news production over the next few days. I'm sure lots of you are doing election news specials, and I hope maybe it informs some of the more academic work that you might be doing too. This afternoon, we have 4 colleagues speaking to us who come all from journalistic backgrounds. We're going to start with Karen Turner. And Karen is an associate professor at the Department of Journalism at Temple University in Philadelphia. And Karen has been involved in journalism and journalism education for several decades now, and has worked in a number of jobs that have been journalism related. She was the press secretary to the Mayor of Philadelphia for a period of time. And she brings a very interesting perspective on how students and local journalists are addressing issues around getting accurate information to voters, and also issues of voter suppression. And that's something we've heard much about here in the UK recently. Channel 4 News, as I'm sure some of you might be aware, did a really interesting investigation with the Miami Herald into voter suppression in the 2016 election in Florida. We're also joined by, and I don't think, Brendan, we've ever had anybody speak to the AJE who's won quite so many awards as you have done. And we have our own James Mann, who I know that you know, Brendan, and James is quite an award winner in his own right. But you certainly eclipse him. So Brendan is the chief investigator for 11 Live and the co-anchor of The Reveal, which is a weekly investigative show on Atlanta's Tegna-owned NBC affiliate. Brendan's been, like everyone else here, a journalist, a reporter for many decades. He's been a war reporter. He's covered American elections. He has, in fact, won 105 regional Emmys, and one wonders what the size of that shelf is like where you keep them all. You've reported from across the United States, and you've quite recently also received awards. And I've been watching your tweets recently, Brendan, where you've been discussing, you know, I know that Georgia is a state that could go, that could possibly go either way. I've been watching the really up-to-date reporting that you're doing, so I'm sure you're going to provide us with a really interesting discussion where you're going to look at election disinformation, and how journalists are countering some of the false narratives around the campaign. We're also delighted to have Brooke, and Brooke joins us from See Boundless, which is an organisation which is telling stories in really interesting and different ways. And I would really urge anybody to have a look at the See Boundless website. Brooke, who has worked in the academic environment at Georgetown University, where she ran the journalism programme, but your organisation, Brooke, is doing really interesting and innovative stuff on VR, AR, and is working really closely with education to look at different ways in which we tell news stories, in which we tell any stories, in fact. And you're going to be talking today, you've given us a really unique perspective on this particular campaign and how it differs, but also how there are some similarities with previous campaigns. And then we've got Ted. Now, Ted is, you know, familiar to colleagues here at the AJE. Ted is a senior lecturer and associate professor in critical media practice at Lancaster University. As a journalist, his work has appeared in publications all over the world: the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Guardian. He's a very prolific researcher, and we see his work in lots of learned journals here in the UK and in other parts of the world. Ted has taught at a number of different universities: Florida International University, Missouri's Reynolds Journalism Institute, and was also a research fellow in the Department of Journalism at Oslo Metropolitan University in the last few years, as well as being a town-night disruptive educator at City University in New York. And I really like that notion of a disruptive educator, because I noticed, Brendan, in your clip, I think you're playing some of the words from John Lewis, who talks about good trouble, and I'm very much a fan of good trouble and disruption. Ted's going to be telling us about the power dynamics at the centre of Trump's war in the news media, and how, in some respects, this is presenting the news media and journalism with an opportunity to reset itself and to rethink what it's doing. So that's a very short overview of what everyone's going to be talking about this afternoon. We're going to try as far as possible to keep to time. So each of our speakers have 20 minutes, and that will leave us with about half an hour at the end to share, ask some questions, and have some discussion. If anybody has any questions, please use the chat throughout, and take the opportunity to, particularly the students who are here, you know, take the opportunity to pick the brains of our very learned panel. So once again, I just want to very warmly welcome everyone to this afternoon's event, and to hand over to Karen, who's going to be starting us off today. What I would ask is if people can maybe mute their mics so that we don't get any noise while each of the speakers are speaking. Karen, have you got your slides sorted? Are you ready to go?
We're going to try this, Margaret. You know, we're going to do the best we can. Everything is here. It just may not look as smooth as I would like it to, but that's okay.
I have to say, you know, the AJE is quite renowned for things not running smoothly on occasion. So please don't feel that anything different is going to be happening today.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we're going to get through this, and I think we're going to have some fun this afternoon. Okay, so as you see, my talk is basically going to focus on working with the next generation of journalists. Back. Okay, so I've The student projects that I'm going to be talking about are listed, and I'll briefly say something about each. And then at the end, I'm going to talk briefly about conversations I've had with the students and local journalists, particularly journalists in Pennsylvania, about election reporting. So the first project I'm going to briefly talk about is a public affairs program called the Broader View. Then I'm going to talk about a New Hampshire primary reporting trip that we took in February, and then the crowdsourcing US Election Day project that I have been working on with a colleague since 2004. So Broader View, basically, I started the course in fall of 2014 because one of the things that I wanted to emphasize, and I think it's so very important, is that interviewing skills, journalistic interviewing skills are very important. And so also based on department surveys that we had, students were saying that that was an area where they wanted more practice. And I have been doing public affairs reporting for about 30 years. And so I really wanted to bring that experience into the classroom. And so I created this course, A Broader View, and it has a strong social media footprint through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And so what happens is during the semester, the students work in teams. They produce 3 30-minute shows. They also do 2 individual podcasts, and they serve as the hosts, the producers, the reporters, and it's produced in collaboration with a colleague's studio production class. So we present the content. And of course, as with many production courses, the sausage making, and I'm kind of feeling like this today as I'm dealing with these slides, can be frustrating for the students. So, however, in the end, the classes have produced interesting and informative content. So what happened every October, I tend to do an election show. And so this year, with the importance of the presidential race, we decided to look at voter suppression tactics and the anticipated higher than normal youth vote. And the show just aired live on Monday. I told Margaret about this. I don't know if she was able to see it. But I'm going to jump out of this for a second and show you about 2 minutes just at the top of the show so you can get a sense of what the show's like. And then also the fact that we had to make accommodations for COVID because we did, in fact, it aired in the studio. So let me just stop that share and let me bring this up. And let me go back to trying to share again my Zoom meeting. I do talk to myself. Okay, and so this is our episode. Let me just come down a little bit so I can just to give you a flavor of it. And you can see some of the other shows that we've done in the past. So let me just.
Welcome to A Broader View, a show where we discuss issues that shape our lives. We'll give you a broader view of what people are talking about or should be talking about. My name is Raja Ahmed. Today with my guests, we'll discuss the threat of voter suppression in this upcoming election. Here's my co-host.
Hi, I'm Emanuela Pierre. In my segment, we'll discuss anticipated youth voting in this historic election and delve deeper into what's happening locally. We'll also talk about voter education for young people under 18.
Both of these topics look at the importance of voting in this upcoming election. So please join us as we take a broader view. America has a long history of deliberate voting disenfranchisement. Black men only won the right to vote in the mid-19th century, and it was 100 years ago this year that white women won that right. It took the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act to give all citizens the protections to vote. However, voting rights activists say the Supreme Court's Shelby decision has gutted the act, paving the way for states to enact laws aimed at suppressing the vote. Voter ID laws, voter intimidation, and purging voter rolls. These are just some of the suppressive tactics in use today. And election experts say COVID-19 has exacerbated the problem. To talk more about this and its effect on the 2020 general election, we have our studio guest, Temple University's Chris Gary. He's overseeing the Temple Votes program that's out of the Dean of Students' office. Our second guest is David Levine, joining us by Zoom. He is the Elections Integrity Fellow at the Bipartisan Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thank you, both of you, for joining us here today.
Okay, so let me stop that. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of what the show looked like. Okay, and so let me get back. And so the students, they came up with specific topics within the election theme. I gave them the theme, they came up with the topics. And so we used the app Slack to have a conversation around ideas. And some of the other things that were proposed that obviously we didn't go with, the recent announcement by the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, from this point forward, they're saying that Election Day is going to be an official holiday for athletes where there will be no practices or competitions. And then another issue that we considered, will low-income communities get the resources needed for mail-in voting? And then looking at the Pennsylvania down ballot races. And since Pennsylvania is a battleground, and certainly in the US, we talk about elections like some type of competition. So since Pennsylvania is a battleground or a swing state, we went with the voter suppression and the youth vote. And it was actually live because we wanted to get the show out there to our audience when there was still time. Actually, it was the day before Pennsylvania stopped its in-person voting. And the whole semester, because of the ubiquitous nature of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, the Broader View episodes, the first and what we're planning soon, our last, the students really are planning to explore some aspect of systematic racism. So it really, I guide them, but I give them the empowerment to really come up with the topics, come up with the guests. And the fact that COVID has been a challenge, but the fact that we can use Zoom and bring people in from all over. And the second segment of that show, we had someone from Philly, someone from Boston, and someone from Maryland. Someone from DC. So with Zoom, we're trying to, in terms of our teaching, incorporate that in because it's a positive thing. But let me move on. All right, so that was one. The next, in February, we did our New Hampshire reporting trip of the primary. And this was part of the Media and American Politics course, which is taught by a colleague, David Mindage, who's also the chair of our department. And we had 28 students and 3 Klein faculty. I was one of the faculty. I've covered several political conventions. And it's been some time since I've covered a primary, so I really wanted to be able to go and to share this experience with the students. So we were there from Friday, February 7th to Tuesday, which was the day of the primary. We left that evening. And so basically we wanted the students to learn how media, politicians, and political parties how they worked together to pull together this, this primary. And so what the students did, since when we got there, they went to debate watch parties, Democratic and Trump rallies, a major Democratic dinner that all of the candidates went to because everybody was still in it at that time for the most part, is this McGuire-Shanine dinner. And then Dartmouth College, which is my alma mater, we had a lunch, and there were also some rallies by some of the candidates on campus. So we were able to spend the day there. So just to give you a sense of what it looked like, they did a story on us with WGBH. They saw these students around. And so one of our students got to interview who is now Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden. And so what the students did was they basically covered the second and third tier candidates. And I'm not going to go to this link, but you can certainly take a screenshot. If you want to see, there were about 22 presidential hopefuls, we call them, who were not really getting much attention. And so to get phone calls from students from Philadelphia who were planning to be in New Hampshire, calling you on the phone, many of them were really excited to hear from them, and they had to do reports talking about the platforms of these various second and third tier candidates. And so it gave them some publicity, and a couple of the students actually had a chance to meet the candidate who they had interviewed. And so also as part of this in the spring, I do a broader view show because I don't actually teach it as a class. And so in the spring, I do 2 interview shows, and the show that I was able to get in before we had to close down for COVID was to interview the 3 Masters of Journalism students who had gone on the trip and who had various experiences. And it was really interesting to bring that to that audience and give them an opportunity to talk about what they had learned, especially as Masters of Journalism students on this particular trip. All right, and so the last project I want to tell you about is this crowdsourcing project. And this is a project that I have been working with Susan Jacobson. She's now with Florida International. She was with Temple at the time when we started this in 2004. But some form of this project has been going on since 2004. And as the description says, we started this on LiveJournal, and then in 2010, we moved it to Facebook. And so that's where it is housed now. And so let me see if I can, I think we're short on time, so I better not. I've got some screenshots though. This is what the page looks like, the Crowdsourcing US Election Day page on Facebook. And so what the students do is they post various videos. And like I said, you can go back to 2010 and see what the students have been doing. So every election, be it a primary election, obviously it's been challenging when we had off-year elections. But we have content here from 2010 on looking at not only how the technology has changed, but the way in which we do our storytelling. And so just to give you an overview, the students started out in 2004, actually before smartphones were smart, so it was a real challenge. But now we ask the students to use their smartphones or Zoom, because obviously we have to be mindful of COVID, but we're asking them to shoot and edit 1 or 2 videos based something related to the election, whether coming up to the election or election day. and they're going to upload them to YouTube or Vimeo. We had in the past required the students to join our Facebook group, but over the past couple of years, we've discovered that more and more students don't even have Facebook accounts. And so we give them the choice of just sending us the links, me and Susan, and we will post them to Facebook, or they can join the Facebook page. And what's been beautiful about this is over the years, because so many students have done this assignment, we find that on election day, a lot of alums will check the page, make comments, ask students questions about the stories that they've posted. So it's been very interactive. Getting back to what we require, we ask that the videos be between 30 and 90 seconds. And as I said, it could be a pre-election day activity. Obviously, this was a little more robust when we weren't dealing with the restrictions of COVID. But there are still some things going on, and we talk to students about how to do socially distancing interviews. And something that is relatively new in terms of getting content, we tell students that they can share in Instagram or TikTok, but obviously the content has to be edited. And as I said, they can safely interview their subjects for this particular project. So some of the questions that we ask the students, just kind of to get the juices flowing, to ask them who they're voting for, because in-person voting is really challenging, particularly challenging this year because of COVID. I think understanding what that in-person voting experience is really crucial. And so that was a question that we've added. And so actually, part of my excitement talking to you is that one year, Susan happened to be in London when our election was going on. And so her students still did this assignment and found some expats, talked to them, found some Brits, asked, what do you think about what's going on in the US? And so I invite any of the faculty who are listening to this, if you'd like more information about this, we would love to have an international experience where your students could certainly post to our Facebook page. My email address, kturner@temple.edu. We can talk a little more, but I think it would be fascinating to find out, what do you know about the US presidential election? What do you think about the domestic reporting, your reporting of our international event? I think we would probably be a little upset when we heard what you had to say. And then what do you think, of course, of the US candidates? So those are the three projects that I have been working on. And so just in terms quickly of conversations that I've had with students and journalists about election reporting, and why this is so important is that the right to vote is the bedrock of US democracy. So getting clear and accurate information to voters is paramount. And I think that's what you're going to hear from everyone. This is so crucial that we get it right and that we are accurate. So some of the things that I had talked to the journalists about and my students, because we are in Pennsylvania, it is a battleground state. And so we are getting a lot of attention, and there's a lot of misinformation. So what I've been telling my students and telling the local reporters, it's important to engage the policymakers and the election officials to talk about the barriers, especially for communities of color. Internet access, I think when we all shut down, we really didn't think about the fact that so many people don't have internet access, and what does that mean? There were issues about not having postage paid envelopes for mail-in ballots. A lot of people didn't have access to printers, didn't have access to postage, and the libraries were closed. So many people depended upon libraries. So that was very important. You must have diverse voices. We talk about that all the time, the importance of not going to the usual people who you talk to, broaden your base of experts. And so you want to hear diverse voices, go to people directly and find out what was preventing them from using the mail-in option, which in the case in Pennsylvania, we were talking a lot about. I suggested reaching out to religious institutions to identify congregants, to talk about what their personal stories were, and to also put information like that on, if the church or synagogue or mosque had a website, put information on that website. Also use social media, of course, to identify people. Legacy journalists, I always remind them to partner with local ethnic media. They have a lot of connections in various communities, and it makes the story richer. I think it's also incumbent upon journalists and our journalists in training to keep explaining why voting is important. I think sometimes that gets lost, but it's something that we need to be talking about all the time. Also explaining why the evidence of voter suppression. We talk about the long lines, we talk about the voter purges, but we don't talk enough about what happened, and especially the gutting of the 65 Voting Rights Act, Shelby v. Holder. And this is a result of that. We need to be reminding people, yes, this is what happened. So hopefully when we're on the other side of this, some changes hopefully will be made, because I think it incenses me to see people in the US have to stand in line to vote. Explain the rights when voting in person, and this is going to be more and more critical as we approach Tuesday. What happens if you're feeling intimidated? I just saw a story this morning on national news talking about militia groups watching people as they're doing their early voting in line. What are your rights as a citizen? You want to vote and you're feeling intimidated. Also, timelines with deadlines. So very important in the reporting to constantly remind people about those deadlines. And my last point, these cannot be one-time stories. So I said, constantly remind people of these various crucial issues. So with that, I am going to say thank you. And I look forward to any questions that come up at the end of our time together. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karen. I think that raises some really interesting issues, which I think, tie into some of the things that the other speakers are going to be saying. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in, we can obviously pick this up, but that sense in getting the young people who are coming into the industry to sort of think differently and act differently. Because actually the environment that they're reporting in almost demands that now. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's something we can pick up. And certainly Karen's information we will share widely so that any, I've seen a couple of colleagues saying they would like to be involved.
Oh, great.
Karen. So we will share that through the AJE so that people can contact you too.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And it all worked very well, I think, technically. Can I move on next to Brendan Keefe? And Brendan, as I said, is joining us. He's a journalist who is actually out in the field at the moment. And I will hand over to you, Brendan, without much ado.
Thank you, Margaret. And to follow on what Karen said, I'm actually working on a story today about Shelby v. Holder and what's happened in Georgia. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, which is suddenly a swing state. It's a battleground. This was unthinkable for 12 years ago. In fact, I'm sitting in the Georgia 6th Congressional District, which was Newt Gingrich's congressional district, and now it is in the hands of a Democrat. So that's telling you about the changing demographics, particularly in suburban Atlanta, where I am. So I'm doing a story. I've interviewed an MIT expert, someone from the Secretary of State's office here who handles voting in Georgia, and also a nonpartisan voting rights group, talking about the changes in Georgia since Shelby v. Holder. And oh, by the way, Margaret, keep me honest on time. So if I go over 20 minutes, just I'm known to go over. I married a news producer who constantly tells me to wrap it up when I'm talking too much. So she started by whispering in my ear in an earpiece, and that's where the romance started. Anyhow, I myself have been standing in line to vote. In fact, let me share you my screen, because my title screen here is actually, here we go. That's me. That's a shot I took with my iPhone while waiting in line to vote in Georgia. I know this has shocked people around the world, particularly in third world countries and emerging democracies, to see the, traditional leader of the free world or democracy, to see voters standing in line waiting to vote. This was an early voting location, but this is also my actual voting precinct, and it's a new location. The county where I am is the county seat, essentially, or the state seat of Georgia. It's Fulton County, where Atlanta is. And there are 91 new polling locations out of 255 polling locations. So, and that doesn't include all the people who suddenly find themselves having a new location. It used to be, before Shelby v. Holder, the state and the counties would have to go to the Department of Justice and essentially apply to move a polling location, even if it was just across the street. Now they can move that polling location at will. And what we see now in Georgia is millions, literally millions more registered voters than there were in 2013 when the Shelby v. Holder decision came down from the Supreme Court. And yet we have fewer polling places and fewer polling machines. And what this means is lines. And I want to talk a little bit about lines in a minute too, because we want to talk about, what do the lines mean? The lines are kind of a Rorschach test for partisans. Some people see the lines as a sign of progress, and others see them as a sign of decline. I tend to see them as the cue for the bog roll or the loo roll or the toilet roll during COVID here in the US, where suddenly the vote seems limited, and it's backfired. These attempts at voter suppression have backfired, because what they have done is they've just motivated people, because it's no longer just a right, it now feels like a duty. That's just my theory. I have no research on that, but it's just my observation in 30 years of covering elections. Just a little more background on me. Here's my contact information. I'm the chief investigative reporter at 11 Alive, which is the national broadcasting company affiliated station in Atlanta. But I also work for a national company called Tegna. We have 60 stations around the United States. And I've also covered elections for the company. I covered the 2000 presidential election, traveled with then Governor George W. Bush for a year as he was running for president. Was in Austin on November 7th, 2000, when we didn't have a president, which I'll show you here in a minute. I covered the both 2016 party nominating conventions, which was interesting. And today I'm going to talk about the importance of an informed electorate. An informed electorate is the cornerstone of any free society, particularly a democratic republic such as the United States of America. The problem is that we're also a capitalist society. I mean, the alternative is a government-run press, but in a capitalist society, it's a free market press, which means the public is free to select sources of news that tend to confirm their established biases. And so we've seen, particularly on the national level in the 24-hour cable news nets, sort of the corollary to like Sky News, we've seen people select the news source that most closely aligns with their already firmly held political beliefs, creating these silos and echo chambers. And local television news in the United States is, according to the Pew Research study, the most respected source and really the last bastion of truly fair and down the middle reporting. And that's something we hold dear because it's a sacred trust. So I'm going to show you a preview. This is a world premiere because it hasn't aired yet. It's running on Sunday in Atlanta. But I'm hoping our international viewers and audience members today know who John Lewis was. John Lewis recently died. He was an Atlanta congressman, but he was much more than that. He was a civil rights leader who famously marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in 1965, only to be met with billy clubs, and he was beaten within an inch of his life. I use his words in this story, talking to some random voters in Atlanta. And just to give you a little teaser, there's a surprise about 3/4 of the way through. That's why we call our show The Reveal, by the way, is our style of storytelling is to not just tell you a story, but also to sort of reveal things in the middle or toward the end of the story that are enlightening, where the typical local news tends to lead with the surprising thing. We tend to hold that back. So take a preview. I believe I'm sharing computer audio, so you just let me know if you can't hear it.
Your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have to create a more perfect union.
In the shadow of downtown Atlanta, one man marches for freedom.
Together we stand, and divided we fall.
A retired bishop now preaching the gospel of equal voting rights.
What difference will my one vote make? It makes all the difference in the world.
The bishop feeds his flock at the Vine City Community Center, but he also dishes out wisdom to the next generation.
If it is to be, it is up to we, not me.
Just across the street, the faces of larger-than-life civil rights leaders who help secure voting rights brick by brick.
I'm standing on each one of those persons' shoulders, and hundreds more, thousands more whose names that we don't even know, the things that they went through in order to be able to vote. To count the number of marbles in a bottle. Ridiculous questions like how many bubbles in a bar. So that's real. Those are not stories that somebody just made up. Those things actually happened.
In 1965, lining up to march. In 2020, lining up to vote. After 55 years, it's still about access to the polls. Just imagine if every time you went to the grocery store, you found the doors locked, the store closed, it had moved across town, and there were fewer locations. But we're not talking about milk and eggs. We're talking about the right to vote. And many Georgians have seen their polling places close or move across town. In fact, there are fewer polling places this year than there were in 2012, when there were millions fewer voters in Georgia.
They removed machines, so the lines became longer, of course, the wait times as well. So that discouraged a lot of people, but I felt that was my duty, so I always stuck it out.
This father from College Park waits longer and longer to cast his ballot, sometimes spending hours in line. Is there anything that could stop you from voting this year?
No. This one vote could change the lives of our children, our grandchildren.
My children's children's children.
These two voters, separated by 3 decades in age, have never met, but they share a common sense of purpose.
My name is John Lewis.
My name is John Lewis.
They share a name with the John Lewis, who paid for their right to vote with his own blood.
And I said to all of the young people, you must get out there and push and pull and make America what America should be for all of us.
Aren't we all John Lewis?
Yeah, if that will to fight for everyone's right to vote, then yes.
A motivation to me all of these years to continue.
There are dozens of new polling places general election voters will have to find on November 3rd. One of them is here, John R. Lewis Elementary School in DeKalb.
It's powerful.
I mean, the idea of people walking under the name John Lewis and then casting a ballot in a general election. John Lewis is gone, but is his work finished?
No, I don't think his work is done yet.
We've accomplished much, but there is much more that has to be done.
Give us a vote.
So, by the way, I'm my own photographer and editor. So my concept for those video journalism students out there is I believe that one person with multiple small cameras is more powerful than 2 people or 3 people with one big camera. It also makes for more intimate interviews. The largest camera used in that shoot was a DSLR, was a Sony A7 series. So voter suppression and disenfranchisement, that's a lot of what we're covering. the reason I selected those men, it was more than just a gimmick. The assignment was go talk to some random voters. I said, well, if they're truly random, then let's also make sure they're all named John Lewis. What's the difference if they're random? And so the fact that those men were named after their fathers who were not named after John Lewis, it's just, we ended up with these two very interesting stories from these two men. And the fact they're named John Lewis sort of underscores that we're all John Lewis. So here's what we're facing. Fewer polling places here in Georgia. That's also echoed across the country. Changes in polling places from election to election. That's happened to me, where I voted in the same place for 6 years since I've moved to Atlanta, and now suddenly I have to find a new place on election day. Fewer voting machines at each polling place. And that's a concern too, because that means the long line is going to take longer. The long queue is going to take longer to get up there. Obviously, voter ID requirements are a concern because that adds another layer. It's kind of a poll tax that you have to have this document, even if you're a citizen, to vote. Policies that disproportionately affect Black and brown communities and naturalized immigrants. What this is more than just, there's two, in investigative reporting, we kind of have two sayings, or there's two options when we discover corruption, or we discover systems that aren't working. It's inept or corrupt. It's malfeasance or malpractice. Some of this is just the effect of saying, okay, well, we're going to register everyone who gets their driver's permit, their driver's license is going to be automatically registered. That means that 90% of the people who are eligible to vote in Georgia are actually registered because they have motor voter, which means when you get your driver's license, you're registered to vote. But if you don't have a car, that automatically takes you out of that system. Or if your polling place moved from walking distance to 2 bus transfers, and you work an hourly job where your boss won't let you off for more than a couple of hours to vote, does that then disenfranchise you as a voter? Because you get to that closed location, realize you have to go across town to another location, and now you may not be able to vote and your vote doesn't count. Targeted geofencing adverts and disinformation, that's the Channel 4 investigation that Margaret referenced. It was so good, where they discovered this targeting of voters for deterrence, trying to actually not just get their vote out, but to keep the other side from voting, which is amazing. They can literally advertise, not just on social media, even on our own website. You can buy advertisements at our TV station's website that target only a certain number of blocks. So then you can say, okay, we want to take this particular precinct and get them out to vote or not get them out to vote. All of this, of course, is about making it harder to cast a ballot. And if you're targeting one side over the other, then that is also, really devious stuff, right? So I covered the 2000 presidential election, and this was fascinating. Obviously, it ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. It took almost 5 weeks to select a president, and I was there in Austin covering the election. I'm going to play the video here in a second, but a much younger me, a thinner me with more hair will tell you 20 years ago that all of the reporters went to sleep that night. Like they came out, Haley Barbour, who was the Republican Party chairman, came out and said, well, we're not going to have a decision tonight. Everybody go to bed. And all the reporters went to their hotels and went to sleep. I went to the Austin American-Statesman newspaper, which was George W. Bush's morning paper, to witness them destroying 89,000 copies of Bush Wins. And they wouldn't let us take a picture of them destroying the headline or take a souvenir. This was sort of the Dewey beats Truman headline that's, in every journalism book. So here, take a look.
Like many papers across the nation, the Austin American-Statesman, Bush's own morning paper, went through 3 headlines: photo finish, history on hold, and the third headline, well, you can probably guess, and I can't tell you. 89,000 papers were printed with the headline Bush wins. Those copies were destroyed, along with Bush's hopes of a clear victory. Let's go back in time now. The moment of victory early this morning. The eyes of the world here on Austin, Texas, as the governor of our state is selected as the 43rd president of the United States. Right here on Congress Avenue. And the significance, Congress, all of it, House and Senate, and now the White House, ruled by Republicans.
That was an aspirational report, and I don't mean I was pulling for one side or the other. What I meant was I was recording it, expecting to use it the next day, and that never aired. I just found this in my archives, which is interesting. So then it turns out I was asking my then girlfriend if she wanted to go to a trip to Europe, and not knowing that I was going to ask her to marry me on the Eiffel Tower. And I also asked her, because I was a workaholic, to shoot a news story for me on vacation while we were getting engaged. So the whole point was that here we found ourselves throughout Europe. And I think there's some echoes right now of the United States reputation, particularly democracy and elections. I just wanted to take the pulse of, Europe. How does Europe view the US? And so this is the piece I put together.
So what is the world opinion of the United States now that the presidential fiasco is just about over? Well, we came to Europe to find out, and it's making headlines all over the world.
In London, there was underground support for Al Gore.
We've had a lot of bad publicity on George Bush. There was a big fallout in English newspapers with tons of people dying by the hand of George Bush.
And here in Venice, Italy, there are concerns the entire city is sinking into the water, while across the Atlantic Ocean, there are concerns that the greatest democracy in the world may be sinking a bit as well.
We are somehow relieved that this problem are not all in Italy.
You can almost hear the snickering half a world away.
It's really funny. All the people are waiting for the end of this mess.
Some Europeans have supported George W. Bush, others Vice President Al Gore. But here in Switzerland, well, they've chosen to remain neutral.
And they've really acted in a partisan fashion, according to the Republicans.
There's just no escaping the crisis. Despite their distance, Europeans remain just as confused as we are.
I don't know if it's an election or a judgment. I don't know what it is now.
So has world opinion of the U.S. really changed?
No, it's the same. I love the United States.
Doesn't look good from England, put it that way. It doesn't look good at all.
There's a joke going around the internet that Great Britain would like to reintroduce us to the world of imperial government. But the truth is the United States will emerge even stronger after this crisis, simply because of it. In London, Brendan Keefe, News 2 Houston, Nightbeat.
Okay, so pardon the puns from a much less mature reporter back then. And I think there was a very optimistic tone at the end that I probably wouldn't share standing on the embankment today. So election security is obviously a big concern right now. This is what, I mean, I'm not saying this is some sort of news flash. We're not expecting any unrest here in the US, but we're preparing for it. And as journalists. So we've all been put on 12-hour shifts, sort of prophylactically, starting on election day, that we're going to have to respond should there be an extended battle over who's the next president. Obviously, we have increased hacking from abroad, Russia, I should have put in all caps, and then China and Iran. Access to voter lists through public records. There was a big story in the past week about how the Russians, the Iranians had obtained voter lists and contact info. If you're willing to pay and you're a journalist or another, in most states, it's a public record. The voting records are public record. And we have a very robust Freedom of Information Act and state information acts. They vary by state, but in some states, you don't even need to tell them who you are. In other states, you have to either be a campaigner or a journalist, but you can get voter lists, including contact information, email, phone number. There's obviously a lot of disinformation out there. In fact, just my regular posts on Facebook yesterday, the day before, I've noticed they've been heavily throttled, just sharing information from the officials. I'm noticing I'm getting very little engagement or interaction on my videos and posts. And it's very clear that this is an attempt, they're basically throttling all election information to try to stop disinformation from getting through because they simply can't stop it quickly enough, which is an issue unto itself. And that someone should write a doctorate thesis on what's going on right now on Facebook and Twitter. Obviously, voter intimidation, which is illegal, but it's also, we have the First Amendment for freedom of speech. You can stand a distance from the polls and scream at people and say, other than threatening to kill them, you can pretty much intimidate voters as they head to the polls, as long as you're at a safe enough distance under the law. Obviously, as I mentioned, voter suppression is an issue. And then we have an intentional erosion of confidence in the outcome. And that's really frustrating to see that what we have is people basically saying you can't trust the results. And we in our news organization actually had a meeting where we said, please do not participate or amplify things that would tend to make people distrust the outcome. For example, if there's going to be an extended count of ballots, that doesn't mean the system isn't working. It means it's working exactly as it was designed. If we're going to count all the ballots and it's going to take days to do that, that's what democracy looks like. So we have to make sure to provide context, because we have a responsibility to report the truth, but with context. And if, as I mentioned, if we end up with that extended ballot counting, we have to explain how it makes the system work. So this is the most important message that I think I can, and I put it in quotes, but the quote is attributed to me. This is what's striking to me. In 2016, everyone was talking about, well, they hacked the election, but they didn't they didn't get into any voter systems. They don't have to break into the ballot machines. They don't have to access the ballot directly. A foreign power does not have to hack the US election infrastructure. It's much easier to hack the mind of the voter who makes the selections on the machine than to hack the voting machine itself. That's what Cambridge Analytica was about. That's what all of this disinformation is about. If you can convince someone that they're making a free will decision, but you have made them choose another selection than they normally would have, then you have hacked the voter, and you don't have to hack the voting machine. It looks like I'm getting towards the end of my time. Is that right, Margaret? Okay, good. So I'll wrap up here. Disinformation techniques are pretty simple. Fake news stories and misleading social media posts from foreign sources and masquerading as Americans. That's what happened in 2016. Robocalls telling a certain party of voters that they can cast their ballots on November 4th instead of November 3rd. That's actually happened. Oh, if you're a Democrat, you can stay home. Democrats are voting on November 4th. Now you've just disenfranchised people. And this is a big one. That's why I put it in all caps: discrediting legitimate established sources of news and information. If you can discredit the legitimate and established sources, then you can have disinformation have greater effect, so that all you can trust is the dear leader, whoever that happens to be. Get your Guy Fawkes mask on, and we can go into another whole nother discussion on that. So here's what's going on though in 2020 that's different than 2016. Real Americans, witting or unwitting, are compelled to write and post fake news. I have received multiple offers in my inbox because I have an official, a blue check mark on my Twitter account, and particularly on Facebook. Facebook's made it so much more difficult to post fake news from fake sources. They're actually approaching real news people and offering to pay. They're offering to pay me, compensate me to post things on my page as if it's my own, as if it's organic. Which is really frightening. Also, smaller newspapers that have been in trouble here in the US have been purchased and are direct. There's no editorial content. It's all simply pay to play. You can buy a front page headline on a small regional newspaper, which is stunning. It also, now there's fomenting a lack of faith in the election system or the results. And then here's what we must do as journalists. The news media must combat all of these techniques with fact-checking, debunking of rumors and myths, and providing a robust stream of trustworthy, opinion-free, factual information. But as they say, a lie will make it halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. And it's really difficult to compete with salacious headlines that are untrue when you're reporting things that are just factual and opinion-free. People are going to click on that headline. And journalists are starting to be judged by how they, here, I was going to play another story for you, but I don't have time. So let me just, journalists in some news organizations, not mine, are being, their raises are pinned to the number of engagements they get on social media. So if I post something right now on my Facebook page, my work Facebook page, and it starts a partisan fight between Republicans and Democrats, I just toss a hand grenade in there and, let the two sides, go at each other. That's going to increase my engagement. It's going to increase the metrics on my social media. And in some news organizations, that will actually help me get a promotion or a raise. So we have to be very careful not to be part of the problem, because there is the algorithm favors extremism, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, less so, because it's more of a fire hose. But we have to be careful to make sure that our news organizations aren't also going down that slippery slope where engagement drives editorial decision making. And that's my presentation. I'll be happy to answer some questions after everybody else.
Thank you. Fantastic. That was fascinating, Brendan. I hope there will be lots of questions. I certainly have several. I think you've touched on some really important issues, which I think our next two speakers are going to be talking about. That sense of how the election now is quite different to elections in the past, but also there are still striking similarities, and also how there is real pressure and expectation, I think, on the news media to also be taking quite a serious look at itself, and that the role that it plays in terms of telling this story, or telling these stories, because there seems to be a multitude of stories to be told. One of the things I'm really interested in, and we can maybe pick this up, is the point you were making about trusting the results. Certainly lots of the media reports I've been seeing here in the UK seems to be suggesting quite high voter turnout, particularly at the moment. And that really makes you think, well, if there is this real intention to suppress the vote, how successful is that? Because it seems to me, and maybe you can tell us it from a different perspective, it seems to me that people seem to be turning out in quite large numbers at the moment.
But the latest numbers for early voting are 71 million as of this morning have already cast a ballot either through absentee or in-person voting. In many states, it's double the other early vote. Now, the problem is COVID is the X factor. And so you can't, is that some of that because people don't want to go to a busy election day? It's hard to tell right now, but we've already blown through all the records of, and they're predicting here in Georgia that we're going to have almost 6 million of 7.1 million registered voters actually turn out. That's an extraordinary turnout when it's usually something around 50 to 55%.
Yeah, that was the other interesting thing I was reading, and this was something I was talking to my own students about last week, which was voter turnout. And some of the reports are saying that this is going to be bigger than it's ever been before. And that, I think, is, regardless of who wins, that's a good thing if we have increased voter turnout. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, it feels like the leave or stay vote, doesn't it?
It does actually, or the Scottish independence vote, where the turnout is absolutely huge. Yeah, that was fantastic, Brendan. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to Brooke, and as I said, I think there are real similarities between what Brendan has been talking about and what Brooke's about to talk about. So I shall just hand over to you, Brooke. Thank you. Oh, I think maybe, yeah.
So, Margaret, and I'm so thankful to, can you hear me? Of course not, of course.
It was frozen for a second, but you're back.
It was frozen for a second, but I think you're back, Brooke. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So excited to be here and talk to you all.
We've lost you again, Brooke. No, we still can't hear you.
This is my first, oh, lost me again.
Yep, we've got you now.
Oh, hang on one second, I'm getting tech support.
That's absolutely fine.
Of course. It's been fine all morning and then it freaks out.
Yes, that's always the way. Always the way.
Okay. Okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Everyone hear me? Okay. Okay. So I'm so excited to do this. I have been teaching for the last 12 elections, and this is the first one that I'm not. So it's sort of bittersweet not to be in the classroom talking about this with everyone, but I'm super excited because for the last 2 years, I've been working at See Boundless, and we work with a lot of news organizations to do a lot of special projects, a lot of AR, VR, as you mentioned, Margaret. And so I've kind of gotten to see more of a bird's eye view of news organizations and how things work. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about today, as a person who's now a little bit outside of everything, is this idea of, is this a once in a lifetime election?
No, I think we've lost you again, Brooke.
To what we've seen before.
No, you're dipping in and out, Brooke. So we're hearing some and we're not hearing other.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
It may help to disconnect and reconnect. I notice that sometimes helps when this happens to me.
Okay.
Do you want us to come back to you, Brooke? And maybe if Ted's ready to go, he could go.
Yeah, she's dropped that in the chat there, Margaret. So yeah, she's put that down there. So why don't we move to Ted?
Ted, are you ready to go?
Sure, I can. I just hope we can get Brooke back.
Yeah, hopefully we can.
So if it's all right,
Let's see. Brooke, how are you doing there?
I'm good. I switched to my LTE, so I don't know if that helped, but I can try. I'll try, and then if it doesn't work again, then definitely let's move on, because I don't want to be that person who's sitting here taking up everybody's time.
No, don't worry. Let's try again.
Okay. So I wanted to kind of talk through this idea of, I'm going to share my screen here. Is what we're seeing, screen share is not working, so I'm just going to keep talking. Is what we're seeing similar or not similar to what we've seen before? So I'm titling this Deja Vu or Once in a Lifetime. So one of the things that we see a lot in these elections is this idea like, this is unprecedented, what's happening? And I think that there are some things that are still similar to what we saw in 2016 and even before that. The first being Trump. We're all obsessed with Trump. We can't get enough Trump. It's Trump all the time. And I'm assuming where you are, it's also a lot of Trump. CNN, Brian Stelter at CNN just did a great package on, are we seeing a lot more Trump now than we did then? And he found that it's almost exactly the same. The average amount of coverage compared to other candidates in 2016 was Trump would get about 36 minutes on the sort of evening news versus the closest was like 8 or 9 minutes. Currently on CNN, Trump has had 2,500 hours of coverage to Biden's 1,400 hours of coverage. Wow. On MSNBC, it's 2,800 hours of coverage to Biden's 1,700. Now, some of that can be explained by the fact that he's the president, obviously, so he's going to get covered in that role as well as his election role. But we love it. We love, right, the tweets, the crazy, the COVID that he had. So I think in that way, it's really similar, and journalists are really struggling with that. I know I have several journalist friends who cover these elections, and they're saying our ratings go up, right? If Trump's on and he says something crazy, we're all watching it. And I know our previous speakers alluded to that as well. And so it's problematic. You get the ratings, but then you also, in some ways, are giving an unfair advantage. The second thing, when we talk about deja vu, is where people are still using social media. And as our last speaker, Brendan just mentioned, it's still problematic because there's a lot of disinformation on social media. And if people are using that as their primary source of information, then they might not be getting exactly what they need to go out and vote, to know what's going on. I have had several friends tell me that Bill Gates caused COVID and we're all, just waiting to see what he does because he's apparently going to save the world. And they saw it on Facebook because then they saw it on YouTube. And it's definitely something that we're all grappling with right now. The third thing, if we're talking about similarities from the last election, is that we're still talking about a horse race coverage. And I know that this happens in the UK as well. And that's the idea of who's winning and losing, right? So we see a lot of who's up in the polls today, who's down in the polls today, and so there's this narrative of, who is going to take charge, which plays back into this idea of Trump, which he's very into the winning and losing narrative. One of the things that I think was mentioned by both of our previous speakers, which I think is really, really important, is this idea that we're having a lot less local news coverage. So at UNC, we work a lot with University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and they have an entire research center devoted to what they call news deserts. And the website that they're at is usnewsdeserts.com. And they do research on huge portions of the US where there is no one covering local government. There is no one covering local news. And in fact, I sort of printed out some of the latest statistics in their 2020 report. And I just wanted to share some of those with you. And if you go to their website, they have amazing information, which I think is really valuable. So in the 15 years leading up to 2020, more than 1/4 of the country's newspapers have disappeared. That's just in the last 15 years. And since the publishing of their last report, which was in 2018 to now, 300 more newspapers have closed. 6,000 journalists employed by those newspapers have vanished, and print newspaper circulation has declined by 5 million. Despite the efforts of other media, including commercial television and digital sites, they have failed to thwart the rise of news deserts, especially in economically struggling regions of the country. Independent digital sites, once seen as potential saviors, are failing to achieve long-term financial security. While more than 80 local online sites were established in 2019, an equal number were unsuccessful in their ventures. And they're still seeing that happening. And half of newspaper readers and journalists have vanished in the past 15 years. And why this is important goes to what we were just exactly talking about, which is voting, right? If people don't have the information, particularly the local information, they're not going to know where to go. They're not going to know the local issues, which are so important. There was a joke that my family and I always had when Obama was president, and if something happened, it would sort of be like, thanks a lot, Obama. And the idea was everybody likes to blame things on the president, when in reality, we live in a federal system. And so there's a lot that happens, as it does where you all are at the city, state and local level, or city, state and federal level. So it's really important that people are engaged. One of the other things that I would say is sort of deja vu is the lack of focus on, or not even focus on, but reporting on religion and its influence on elections. I think we just had a lot of discussion about it because we just got a new Supreme Court justice as of yesterday who's a very religious person. I grew up in the evangelical church, which is sort of a uniquely American church system. And I think that we can see, I've read a lot of research on this, there's just not a lot of reporting on how this influences the way people see the political system. And I can tell you, this is just anecdotal. I mean, I was taught, and I'm quite a bit older now, but in the 90s, that if you're a Christian, you are Republican. And I think that there's a lot of times not that reporting and that understanding, or it's from such an outside perspective So I really encourage any professors to sort of start to have those conversations with the students, because that is an area that we didn't see covered as much in 2016, and we're still sort of not seeing it as much now. And then the final one that we're still seeing, which Brendan, thank you for introing my talk, which is foreign interference. I mean, it is still alive and well. I was just watching an FBI press conference last week. It's problematic, and I know it's problematic for all European elections as well. I mean, this is not just an American problem. This is a problem across the world right now. And it seems that no one has a great handle on it, and working with these social media companies isn't working out very well. So I think going forward, the more reporting that we can get on this, the better, because it's really affecting people. So I wanted to switch gears then and talk about, this idea of this once in a lifetime election. And I think there are some things that make this election that we're watching unique. The first is the most obvious. We are in a global pandemic. We are still in a global pandemic. And in the US, as I'm sure most of you have been reading, it is getting much worse. And so that, affects this story in several ways. First, the dominant news coverage, even though we're in an election, is still COVID. If I pull up any of the apps on my phone, the first story is almost always still COVID. When I watch the nightly news, the main story is still primarily COVID. And so that's a huge difference from most of the other presidential elections, where there wasn't a dominant news story that took over. But COVID's also problematic for reporting. I have several friends that are, again, on the campaign trail with people, or trying to report senatorial races. It is difficult because they don't want to get sick. And as we all watched happen, several reporters who were covering President Trump did get sick from major publications when the outbreak happened in the White House. And so there's a danger there that sort of wasn't there before. And then there's also a reporting issue, and I'd be interested to see how Brendan approaches this. I have a friend that works for the Wall Street Journal, and she's sort of in charge of covering Arizona next week. And she has gone there several times on reporting trips to see, because Arizona's a battleground state. She is nervous. How do you just go and approach people? What are you thinking? You can't do that anymore. It's not safe. And so that's problematic. And then similarly, the campaign, well, I guess one campaign is being run very differently than it would in previous times. I mean, in previous times, you would see Biden out there, doing huge rallies. You would see them all over the country. You would see people gathering. And obviously we're seeing that from one candidate, but even then it's at much smaller levels, and it's causing a lot of issues. There was a story this morning after a rally in Omaha, Nebraska last night. Trump left a bunch of seniors at an airplane hangar, and 7 of them have been hospitalized because they couldn't get home. So even these rallies are problematic, apart from just COVID. So that's one thing that I think we're going to have a really interesting case studies going forward to learn from. A second thing that I think you're seeing that's really different from before is this concerted focus on states. I think after 2016 and the surprise Trump election, I was randomly in London the morning that Trump was elected, and it was really fun to see all of the newspaper headlines, which I think you all still do the best, I would like to say. It was a surprise to everyone. Even I have family, friends and family that are Trump supporters. They were even surprised. And a lot of that went to, the Electoral College and how people are voting in states, not just at the national level. And I think that now we're seeing a really concerted effort on, how is Trump doing in Georgia? How is Biden doing in Pennsylvania versus just Biden is up 10 points in the polls, which we didn't see before. We always sort of just saw that focus on the larger polls. There's also a larger look because of our dysfunction in Washington at Senate races that you didn't see before. I don't think I've ever followed a senatorial race in South Carolina or a senatorial race in Montana, and suddenly you're reading stories on this because people are realizing how much more power. I mean, they knew that there was a lot of power when you control all the branches of government, but I think that there's a renewed sense of This is important. You're seeing donations to Senate candidates like you didn't before. The person who's running against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, I think, had a 57 million donation haul in just one quarter, which is, I mean, crazy. And that's because people from all over are watching the news and donating to him. And then the fourth thing that I want to mention that I think is really different, and I don't know if it's going very well, is this fact checking happening by social media companies where, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all of these places were sort of hands off before. They're trying to fact check. It's not going so great. I'm sure you've all seen, the little numbers before. Twitter's taken some stuff down, but then put it back up. And it's really causing problems from all sides. And I think, as Brendan just mentioned, I am excited to read the research on what's happening there, because I think they're trying to combat disinformation, but it's not working in the way that they wanted it to when they set out to do it. And finally, the thing that I think is the most interesting thing happened right now, and it really goes into our last two speakers, what they were talking about, was this attack on the democratic voting process by the person who is the current leader of the United States. This is really unprecedented. We've never had the person who leads the country tell the country that their vote might not count, or that it shouldn't count, or voter suppression has existed for the entire history of our country, but it really hasn't existed in such an obvious and forthright way. And for a lot of people, as it should be, it's quite scary, because we're coming face to face both with our past, but also with our future, and realizing that there's core issues there that going forward are going to be really, really tricky. And I think we're all just hoping, because as you all hopefully know, each state, controls their own election, that there's little issues going forward in terms of election certification of votes and what that looks like. And I know a lot of news orgs are paying attention to that and spending a lot of time on that, because we all, just want a peaceful, if Biden would win, transition of power, or if Trump would win, that would sort of not cause issues going forward. So I apologize for the technical issues. There always has to be a speaker with technical issues because it's a Zoom call. I apologize that it was me today, but thank you for letting me kind of share some of my insights on this, and I'm so excited. I already have questions for the other speakers, and I'm really, really excited to chat with everyone going forward.
No, thank you. That was fantastic, Brooke. And it was a shame you couldn't share your slides, but if you do want to send them to me, I can share them afterwards.
Right, I'd love to.
We can put them on the website. And I think, again, you raised some of the really important issues, and you said something at the end there, which I think actually leads really beautifully into what Ted's probably going to talk about. And it is that sense of, the president actually casting doubt on the outcome of the election. And it really sort of strikes me, it reminds me of, even when President Obama spoke, I think maybe the middle of September, he spoke in support of Biden's nomination. And he talked about, it's democracy that's at stake in this election. And really, that's how serious it is. And that was really striking that, you had a former president really criticising a sitting president, saying that you are the threat to our democracy. And there's obviously been, a lot of discussion around that in the US media, and generally, I think probably amongst people who live in the United States as well. And I think, hopefully that will touch on some of the things that Ted's going to say in his talk. So thank you so much, Brooke. That was fascinating. That was interesting. It was great to get that perspective of what's changed and actually what's still the same. So Ted, I'm now going to hand over to you to take us forward and give us your perspective on things. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Very interesting panel to listen to. So I will come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, applying critical theory and cultural studies approaches to not just the election, but to how Trump has changed media. And I think it was interesting already, speakers talking about how journalists haven't really changed how they're covering this election than how they've covered past elections. Voter suppression being talked about by white people, that might be a really new thing. Voter suppression of white people. Voter suppression is not a new thing for the majority of non-white people in the United States. That's been a foundational purpose, right? And so it's the Trump presidency really awoken a lot of different things across society. And what I want to kind of talk about is how journalism may have changed or may not have changed. So that's basically what this argument is. Let me move my little screen here. So the argument that I want to talk about is kind of taking a step back away from the election to kind of give it a bit of a lens. And so my argument's that the rise of Trump and the rhetoric that's been associated with it, the conversations and language about women, about US Blacks and non-whites, about immigration and quote unquote animals coming up across the southern border from Mexico and being put in cages, actually cages that had come from previous deportation efforts of previous presidents, but in horrible conditions and ways, but justified through rhetoric, is, as it says here, unveils, I think, some power structures of and for journalism that has been there. So if Donald Trump has done anything good for journalism, it might be that he's been right about some things, about problems that journalism faces. And
Ted, could I just quickly interrupt you because we can't see your slides properly? They're really small.
Are they small?
Yeah, so we don't see the whole screen. We're just seeing a tiny little thumbnail almost.
Oh, how do you fix that?
Oh, that's it. That's it. It's okay now. Is
that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks. So, so I think that the hard part is, you know, the election situation and whatnot in the States is very emotional. I mean, it's based on a lot of realities, but it's also extremely emotional. And it's been fascinating talking to even other scholars about deeper meanings of the Trump presidency and journalism's role, because they can't get over the fact how much they hate Donald Trump. So I think that that's an issue that even critical scholars who have been my mentors are having a really hard time setting aside their own feelings to kind of go deeper. Now, some would say going deeper into looking in these things somehow normalizes or justifies the racisms and the sexual inequalities and the violence that Trump talks about and that his supporters seem to further. But I disagree. I think that there are foundational aspects of society within the United States that need to be addressed, because that's how we got to this point. So I think it's important also in this conversation that I'm going to share here is to understand there's a difference between local and national press. And that's, you know, most societies have that proximity and size and geography, all those different elements. We are fascinated in the US with national media. That is what we tend to do most of our scholarship about. It's focused on the New York Times and other agenda-setting outlets, cable news, and local news really gets set aside. It's set aside as you know, too nuanced or too novel. And I really think what we're seeing from the last 6 or 8 years before Donald Trump even was a name was the local level. This was how we got to this point was a trickle-up effect, just as much as it might have been a trickle-down effect. It was really a trickle-up effect. It was local communities fighting about transgendered bathrooms, and it was about local school boards fighting about prayer in school, and it was about local communities debating about policing, right? That then made its way up through the ranks to state governors, and we saw the governors of Florida, Wisconsin, and Texas getting together and basically rewriting the scripts of the GOP, the Republican Party. And so this was a trickle up thing, but we don't like that in the States. It's very much everything's trickled down, because then it's harder to get to local news. It's harder to watch those broadcasts. It's harder to get access to something that either the New York Times has free or libraries subscribe to. The library doesn't subscribe to the library in Iowa doesn't subscribe to a newspaper in Florida, for instance, right? So there are some issues here. We're making a lot of judgments and making decisions about how Trump has influenced journalism and society by looking at this from a very narrow scope, the national press, okay? So I'm talking about how Trump's war on press, and certainly it was one that he started, right? I think was a chance for press reflection, but it became a normalized and naturalized sort of battle between the White House and the press. And we ignored a lot of the elements of press power that that Trump actually was providing for me. And sorry, sitting down, sometimes my breathing's a little bit harder, so please forgive me. That's why I was shielded for 3 months during all this COVID stuff. What a time. So the approach that I take to this project and what I want to talk about is using ideas of media power and control. And there are a couple aspects of this that I think I'm taking the subjective, qualitative, critical, sometimes Afrocentric even approach to this, that journalism does operate through banishment, for instance. And these are just a couple concepts to then unpack some of the roles that Trump and the press have had on each other. So journalism has to choose which side of things it wants to cover, right? Whose side's it going to take on democracy? I lived in Miami for 6 years. I lived in the United States up until 2018. I never lived in a democracy. I lived in a police state. I lived in a, what our first speaker mentioned, it's capitalistic society. It's hyper-capitalism, consumption. I'm in the UK. I'm still not living in a democracy, right? The United States isn't a democracy itself. It's a republic, right? And these are distinctions, especially in conservative press, that they want to make. For whatever reasons they want to make it, they want to make these distinctions that this is a republic. It's not a parliamentarian democracy. It's not something else, right? So these are different nuances that we don't talk about. And so we banish from journalism, questions of that. We just say democracy, right? Or we keep out, as we talked about early on, in Al Cross in the US, who looks at rural journalism studies, talks a lot about how, we boost the coasts, right? So we look at journalism in New York, some journalism in LA, but we really don't, because all of us are asleep on the Eastern Seaboard before. So it's kind of like LA becomes a big city, but it's about entertainment. Nothing really seems to happen there otherwise, because it's not coming from CBS News on the whatever floor of a high rise, right? Marginalization kind of goes with that. We saw it from what I was saying with Al Cross, the marginalization of middle America. And we seem to think that we understand that already, so we don't talk about it anymore. We seem to think that, talking about whiteness in terms of both ideological power, but also in the realities of its culture, is therefore somehow reinforcing a power, instead of actually engaging our agency to better understand what we may or may not disagree with. For example, I had a student who wanted to go work with Barack Obama once. And I said, well, what are you reading? Well, I'm reading Barack Obama's book. I said, nobody's going to hire you, right? You need to read something about Ronald Reagan. You need to read something about the other side, not to reinforce and say that that's the right way to do it, but you need to know your enemy in that case, right? And I think journalists aren't doing that. It's kind of what our last speaker talked about. It's reproduction, right? Of things. Surveillance, I think, is another aspect. So that we watch. Journalists watch and they wait for a lot of things to happen. They don't go out and find stories as though they naturally are growing on trees, but they also don't necessarily walk away from the daily rundown of filling the pages or the time to look for something different. And I think we saw, an example in this talk of something that was a bit different, right? That doesn't happen a lot, which is why seeing that trailer was special. So ultimately, and we don't have to go further into this, but journalism, I argue, is a complicated tool for change, perhaps, but it's also a tool for control. The idea that every vote matters is complete hogwash from this perspective, in the sense that it's the Electoral College that makes that decision. And we've seen that in numerous elections, but yet we're so either exhausted or happy at the end of an election, we aren't willing to actually go against the structures that are controlling us, right? And that those structures are fed by corporate lobbying, by weapons industries, by lobbyists of all sorts. We don't take that on to actually make meaningful change in that sense where maybe a vote would matter. And journalism kind of leaves the story and moves on to the next fun thing. What's the president going to do in his first 100 days, right? That's the first story that comes through. What's the first 100 days? Well, criminy, who cares, right? Like, aren't there other things? Why is MSNBC and CNN and Fox News now just all political news? I remember the days when they used to actually have national correspondents who would write about or report about environmental disaster in Phoenix or something. We don't even have that. We have CBS Evening News moving into the swamp from New York. That's the opposite of what they should be doing. Maybe they should be going to Toledo. So there are a couple things a couple themes here that I think journalists and journalism haven't really changed or taken a look at, that Donald Trump and his approach to things revealed were problems. And the first is his law and orderness, right? Look, the presidency is more than just one person, right? It's an institution that's surrounded by institutions. And it's surrounded by those of us who either sit on our hands or get our hands dirty, right? And those who are complacent, or those who are, coercive, or those who are compatible with those ideas and want to gain power from the institution. Since 9/11, local, and this is interesting for people who maybe aren't in the United States, if you don't know this, that since 9/11, even the smallest police departments across the United States received military surplus goods. So they received military tanks that were used in the Gulf Wars that the US didn't need anymore because they wanted to buy and make new ones. They received assault rifles. The university I worked at in Miami had a tank, didn't have a big shooter coming out of, or whatever that's called. I'm too tired for this. But it certainly was something that it would use against citizens in emergencies, right? So protest control, right? Or environmental disaster, right? So that it's actually going to save the public. If we take this out, it's not going to float away. But it's being used by police. They had assault rifles, dozens of assault rifles. Police officers, even in the smallest jurisdictions, often carry 2 or 3 weapons on their bodies, right? Ankle, chest, side, or back, right? So this is a culture that we are allowing and establishing and maintaining and propagating. So when Donald Trump comes along and says, white America first, and we look at gun ownership's associated with whiteness. When they say the Second Amendment is something we want to stand on, and then they go into the hood and they start talking about black folk carrying around guns. Well, we didn't mean the Second Amendment for them, right? So there are these, we don't want black people carrying guns. We want white people carrying guns. These are very core beliefs that do go back, I think, to some of what Brooke was talking about in her position on issues of religion or faith, right? This is something that is ground into society. So I think that you guys can come back and look at these later in the recording to get some other points. So I'll just move through though. But the interesting thing about fake news, when Donald Trump was bringing up fake news, even from the first days, right? He was right about fake news in the sense that again, it's not a natural thing, it's a construction, right? Now we're going back to Gay Tuckman and to other scholars who started in journalism studies, right? That journalism is a manufacturing of ideas. It can't do everything and be everything. So it has to be the thing that resonates the most or is the most salient to its audiences for it to maintain its authority and legitimacy, right? So that means that it has to be about reality, sort of, but it's about explaining reality. It's interpreting a sense of reality, if we must admit that a reality exists. And so it relies on a lot of Gramscian sort of common sense that when I read a story about crime, or I read a story about politics, or I read a story about the economy, I think, yeah, no, this makes sense. I pick up the newspaper and I see that it says business, right? It doesn't say work. It might say money. It doesn't say labor, right? So what's the USA Today or the Wall Street Journal or again, another paper doing if they're having a business section, right? Does that mean that it's promoting capitalism and not necessarily the labor of the worker, right? And we don't really question these things because some people, like my parents, will say you think too much about things, not everything's a conspiracy, right? But these are choices that we make as journalists, and we're not willing to necessarily look at this. There's no, God didn't come down or the winds didn't blow and say, this is how journalists have to work. There are routines that are reinforced and paradigms that are maintained. Where if somebody did come out one day in a newspaper and it said workers instead of business, right, that wouldn't make sense. And we'd have some issues of authority and legitimacy. So I'm concerned that also the fake news issue, when it first emerged, wasn't journalism kind of coming out and saying anything about, that news is constructed and here's how we do it. Instead, they said, yes, there's such a thing as fake news and lies, right? So they reinforced binaries ultimately with different elements in between of maybe not so fake, maybe not so true, right? These different variations, but it's reinforcing the thing that you're wrong and I'm right, right? And ultimately I'm the journalist, so I'm right because I've been around for 20 years or 200 years, and you're wrong because your narrative is completely different than ours. So I'm concerned about that we haven't really explored the fake news beyond its, again, capitalistic sort of motivations to create and reinforce that binary. So I think this also goes with alternative facts, and I'm going to go just kind of go quickly because I know we're late and I want people to ask questions of all the speakers. So Margaret, you can thank me later for skipping slides. Yeah, as I said before, CBS News isn't learning anything. For instance, when it moved from New York to Washington, D.C., what is that telling the public, right? I mean, Donald Trump, said he was going to drain the swamp. That was his first sort of thing. And that was about getting out, I think, institutionalized journalism too. And so maybe this was CBS News' way of saying, we're not going to take it anymore and we're going to dig our heels in. But what does that say to people who already see an elitist focus, whether you agree with it or not, an elitist focus of the news? So there's a geographic element here that I think we need to deal with. But the bigger problem here is going to be journalism post-Trump. So whether that's in January or that's going to be in 4 years from January, Donald Trump says the press is the enemy of the people, and there's a generation of people who are out there who believe that. And let's be true and honest about something, that journalism hasn't been a democratizing tool for many in the world. It doesn't tell the truths of many communities and individuals of many different skin tones, particularly non-white individuals, right? You could even go into Appalachia and talk to white miners and talk to white rural folk, and they'll say the same thing. But journalism is in particular been opposed to truths coming from non-white interpretations of the world, be it economies, forms and means of education, employment, not to mention the socio-cultural aspects of relationships and who we are. And so that's not going to go away, right, post-Trump. And we need to think about what that means. I think journalists need reflexivity. We need more action and change. I've been around, and I might have said this, and this may have been the same speech from a couple of years ago, Margaret. The same idea that I've been listening to people talk about hiring Black folk in newspapers for 30 years, for 25, 30 years. That's how long I've been, about 35 years, I'll say, is about what I've been doing this, and it's been the same thing, right? And the same sort of stories about why we aren't diversifying our newsrooms. And Donald Trump has shown, as I said, that some of the vulnerabilities, and one of the vulnerabilities is that we aren't diverse. We're not maybe diverse in the ways he wants, which he wants to have more conservative voices or people who are just pro Donald Trump. But I think he's unveiling also that there's a lack of diversity in ways that we know and we just choose not to address. So, you know, the sources that kind of put all of this argument together, it can be found in these different books. One's going to come out next year, if I ever can finish writing it. But I think this isn't meant to be a battle about if journalism is good or bad. This is a cultural discussion about the role that journalism plays. And when we look at things in only a normative level, which is really helpful and good, right? And we lose some of the critical perspectives, particularly critical race theory, which is something Donald Trump's also trying to get rid of in education. We're left where we started. And so I think that, you know, whether Donald Trump gets elected or not will make a big difference on a lot of individual lives and collectives out there in the United States. But I think that it's also leaving journalism vulnerable to not changing its ways. So anyway, these were just kind of my thoughts. And I really was just going to wrap it up so that we could have more of a lively discussion.
Thank you, Ted. That's great. Really interesting. You made me think quite a lot about an opinion piece that I read in the Washington Post in probably maybe late August time. It was certainly the summer. It was Jonathan Capehart, and he was basically saying that this election was a choice between American democracy and white supremacy. And at the time, that sort of pulled me up quite sharply, because it felt as if somebody was really saying it out loud from quite a serious perspective. And I suppose that would be something that I would probably, you know, ask, you know, the people who live in the United States. Is it as stark as that? Is that the choice that the American electorate are facing at the moment? And you made me think about that quite a lot, and that's really resonated with me since I read that. So I think that was really interesting. I think you also touched on some of the themes that obviously our previous speakers touched on as well, in that sense of the narratives that we're engaged with at the moment. And actually, I think each of the speakers has also really prompted me to think about a lot of the discussion that has gone on within the academy of that need for journalism to almost be looking at resetting itself. And I think that, you know, this election, as several events in the UK tell us as well, I think is prompting us to look at that. Can I firstly thank all of our speakers for, I think, fascinating, enlightening presentations that we, I think everybody has enjoyed and got so much out of. Has anybody got any questions? I certainly have a few questions I would like to ask, but does anybody have a question? Karen, you want to ask a question or you want to make a comment?
Yeah, well, actually, yes, it is a comment, and it's tied to what Ted just said. I mean, and I certainly didn't get into this in my presentation, but one of my pet peeves about journalism education is that it's not diverse. And when I raise this issue with my colleagues at national conferences, I mean, we can't even have a conversation about this. And I think, you know, Ted was talking about the lack of diversity when you're talking about news outlets. I mean, that's one thing, but I think if we're going to look at the entire picture, we need to also look at what's going on or not in journalism education.
Mm-hmm. Can I just piggyback on that for a second? I was in a faculty meeting at my last post where I said, I think we need to increase our African-American and Black student population by 10% over the next 5 years. And we need to increase our faculty of Black or African-American identity by at least 1, because we had 0. And the response that came was, yes, Ted's right, which you always need to run for the hills when somebody says that. But the response was, yes, Ted's right. We need to do much more to support our Black and low income students. And I thought, who's conflating this? And I said words I won't repeat here, but, you know, that was taking minutes. Don't attribute that shit to me, right? I mean, so I think it's that sort of aspect. I think you're right, Karen. We just can't have that conversation. And it's quite frustrating.
I think I would absolutely agree. I think there's a lot we can do in journalism education. I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday who was talking about gender in the news media and how we can improve that. And I said that there needs to be greater cognizance from the industry that we can do a lot of really good work in the academy to support change for the future. But as we all know, as journalism academics, sometimes there's real tension here between what the industry chooses to hear from the academy and what it chooses not to hear from the academy. And I think that has long been a challenge. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? Or will Ivor, thank you.
Begin with an apology because I might be asking a question that was covered, but I had to nip off for longer than I thought to another meeting. I was having a conversation this morning with a colleague, a former colleague from the BBC, and we were discussing a petition that was being circulated. I don't know if any of you have seen it, calling on Twitter to, after November the 3rd, to, I'm trying to think of the exact technical phrase they use, but not to allow Trump to tweet without his tweets first being vetted in case he's calling for a violent revolution or whatever. Isn't it amazing to say that and not put a smile on your face? And we were just discussing that broad issue of whether one in favoured basically pre-censorship. I'm not really asking about that. I'm asking our American colleagues or anybody really, how you deal with the problem that we really faced in this country with Brexit. How do journalists deal with lies? And do we, I mean, I've written about this ad nauseum in terms of Brexit. Do you just report it straight and make sure you give Trump, and God, isn't that dreadful? Isn't that dreadful? That just sort of summarizes Biden's invisibility. I couldn't remember his name. Do you give Trump and Biden equal treatment, even though one tells the lies, one tells truth, which is essentially what the BBC did during Brexit? Do you, what's the word, dress up lies and say, today Mr. Trump said the moon was made of blue cheese, although all of the fact checkers tell us it's actually green cheese? Or do you just refuse to report lies because it's inculcating you, it's incorporating you into a lying system? And I think that's a real dilemma for journalists, not journalists working for mainstream media, where they purport to try and, impartial in Will's words, as opposed to activist media. So how do my American colleagues view this problem of reporting lies?
That's such a great question because it's something we deal with every day. What you're talking about is the bias to fairness, which is if we're doing a story that the sky is blue, the bias to fairness would dictate that we would have to give equal time or appropriate, approximately equal time to someone who thought the sky was pink, which is obviously ridiculous. So there are some things that are just, they're just true. And so if someone is saying something that isn't true, how do you cover that? The problem is we're not talking about somebody on the corner of Times Square or Piccadilly Circus just spouting nonsense. This is somebody who's the leader of the free world. So when they say something, that is untrue, it almost has to be covered. I've equated the Trump presidency, and this isn't a political statement, it's more of a journalistic observational statement, to sort of like a car wreck in terms of, there's a reason the motorway is blocked on the side that doesn't have the crash because people can't stop looking at it. So how do you avert your eyes from the car wreck? Our answer, at least in our operation, and we actually have a segment called Verify, where we take rumors, myths, internet things the president might have said, things a politician might have said, and we go out and verify, is this true? The problem is we've discovered that by reporting something that isn't true and even labeling it as not true, it tends to amplify the lie. And so there's a real danger in that. So this is a really simple solution. It's called the truth sandwich. You start with the truth, then you say what someone is saying, you report what someone is saying that isn't true, and you end with the truth. If there's an objective truth, you start with that, then here's the lie, and then you end with the truth. And I don't think we do enough of that. And the other problem is, as you know, right out of the gate, this president declared the press the enemy of the American people. So then that puts us in an oppositional role. Well, the press has always been in an oppositional role with whoever's in power. You know, people are saying, why aren't we holding Hillary Clinton to account in 2020? Because she doesn't have any power. If she was the president, we'd be holding her to account, but she's not. She's a 4-year-ago candidate. And so I think the problem is we have fallen into that trap and I don't think there was another option. But there's this opposition role. And then when you start reporting the truth, then the audience can say, the reader or the viewer can say, oh, well, see, you're just in opposition to the president. You're right. He was right. You're the enemy of the American people. The answer to attacks on journalism is always more journalism. And the answer to fake news is real news. And the answer to lies is truth. So that's my answer, the truth sandwich.
Can I just comment? Sorry, and I don't disagree with Brendan, except to say,
please do.
If we had it's the notion of the absolute truth. I always say to my students, I always prefer Carl Bernstein's definition of truth, which is the best available truth at the time of putting this story together, because the truth sandwich sort of begs the question, yeah, black is white and white is black. But as you said with Trump, it's actually not like that, it's interpretation. But, you know, it's an ongoing issue which we will face.
If I can just add, and maybe Brendan, you want to weigh in on this. I encourage my students to not just look at their favorite news outlet that obviously they feel comfortable getting that news, but I challenge them to look at other outlets. And I do the same for myself. And I feel like I am on like Earth 2 or something when I am looking at the news from other stations. I mean, because it is completely, I mean, we honestly, and I've never felt this before, that our truths, our points of view of the world are completely different. So if that is if that is true, and you know, I've talked to a lot of people about this, then how do you deal with, you know, you talk about your sandwich, and yes, the people who are looking at your station, they get it. Okay, but what about the people who are on a different station? They're not necessarily going to see your truth sandwich.
That's absolutely true. You know, the Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a New York senator, late senator now, said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. When I heard that come out of Vice President Pence's mouth at the vice presidential debate more than once without attribution, even his opponent, Kamala Harris, said, that's a good line. Well, he stole it. He stole it from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who actually stole it from someone else. But when he stole it, he actually gave attribution. I was screaming plagiarism because those of us who come from the academic world, I mean, that's going to get you kicked out off your newspaper for that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right. We live in a world where there are, you know, alternative facts, and it's been manufactured so that you can seek out the truth that you like most. And look, the word objective is used too much. You know, we tell reporters they have to be objective. Well, this can of soda is an object. I am a subject. By definition, I am subjective. And I think it's the same danger as, you know, suppressing desires in the Catholic Church. They're going to come out in really nasty ways among the priesthood. It's the same thing with us as journalists. If you suppress your experience and biases rather than taking them out, examining them, and then trying to be fair, which is a much better goal, it makes so much more sense than trying to be objective. I mean, why would I brag when trying to get a job that I have 30 years experience if by the definition of objectivity, I'm supposed to deny those 3 decades of experience and simply robotically report the news? It's absurd. Instead, we should try to be fair. But then the problem is if you're the last, you know, sort of member of the Church of Truth left standing, and there's no one else in the pews, then what do you do?
Good point. It strikes me that just, you know, a question that is sort of been popping up in my head is as I've been following the election and also just listening to what you're saying. Do you think this is quite possibly an election based on a completely fake view of the world, the United States, what the United States represents, what the role of power is in the United States. Is the whole thing just based on a fake premise that's been propagated by Trump and the politicians? Is that too difficult to answer?
Well, I mean, I think the whole notion of American democracy is fake. I mean, I think that it's you know, when I was teaching in Florida, every bloody classroom I taught in had an American flag in it, you know, an erect flag coming over everything that I had to say. And that was a state law that the American flag needed to be in state funded classrooms. The idea that every vote matters is a bit, as I discussed before, a bit of a fallacy. But yet it's the one thing that we promote. Our heroes that we present aren't necessarily they're not, if there is such a thing as truth, they're not complicated. I mean, I think the whole issue with truth, I mean, and you can call this gaslighting, but the sky isn't blue, right? I mean, the sky is filled with water particles and whatever the hell else it is that I don't even know why the hell the sky looks blue half the time. But right now it doesn't look blue, it's gray. And sometimes it is pink, right? And so, you know, and that's
Good
not
point.
to dismiss, you know, truth, or that's not to attack you either, Brendan. That's just, it's the idea that the United States, because we should also be careful to say America because that's much larger than what we're talking about, but the United States is a democracy. I mean, it's a meritocracy, right? It's again hyper-capitalistic, it's authoritarian, it's hegemonic in its geopolitical positions, right? And it has a history of, you know, Howard Zinn, if anybody wants a really easy read, right? People's History of the United States. It's a manufacturing of real conspiracies, not that UFOs or Elvis, you know, are walking around or floating around in the sky, but actual real conspiracies of how mechanisms and ideas are propagated. And so you know, there's a question, I'll be quiet now, but there's a question here in the chat about digital literacy or literacy movements. And I have to say that literacy movements are again ways of normalizing, creating norms of how to understand the world in media. We have to be careful when we create norms, because then we open up the door for the abnormal, or what we may call the alternative, right? And I think as critical scholars, we need to, you know, the word alternative fact might have a different meaning, right? It might have to do with the subaltern, right? And because there are people who do believe that they're part of a subaltern in the United States that have been oppressed by quote unquote liberal values that are anti-Christian, that are, and so going back to what Brooke was saying about faith-based issues. So I mean, I think this is much more complicated than the notions of truth and false, but also the notion, again, as I said before, of democracy. And I think literacy programs need to, won't ever really exist to make a huge difference if they're not destroying or disrupting the very nature of what we're thinking about the world. It's almost like a Pepsi can. We think that the Pepsi can is aluminum. It's not aluminum. There's plastic on the inside, right? And so until we actually talk about what's on the inside of this thing called the United States, it's no longer an aluminum can. Maybe it's a plastic can. And I think that that's that sort of complexity that's not gaslighting, right? It's like my wall back here, based on physics, isn't white. It's every color but white, right? It's reflecting white and absorbing, right? And so it's the complication of how the world works. It's not, I'm not lying by saying this isn't a white wall. I'm saying notions of physics and how color operate, right, are much more complicated.
Yeah. Thanks, Ted. We've got another question here from the chat from Kat Barr, who's saying, how do you think American attitudes towards politics have changed during Trump's presidency? Does anybody, any of our speakers want to take that on? Brooke, maybe?
Yeah, I want to tag on, and maybe this all ties in. I was just sort of thinking about what we were talking about. And I think there's two issues that I think are also playing into this, and that's education in the US. I mean, we keep going further and further and further and further down because we're not really investing in our education system. It's actually quite archaic in a lot of ways. And I say this, our company does a lot of work with both K through 12 and university education. And so there's a base level that's not happening. And then also, I mean, I'm not a political scholar, but you could say at least the last 20, 30 years, politics in America has been trafficking in identity. It's identity politics. So I think that that's what you see a lot. I mean, even now, you could look at Biden's campaign is, I'm the nice guy who's not Trump. I mean, yes, he has issues and platforms, but it's really, trust me, this guy's crazy. Which is an identity piece in terms of rhetoric. And obviously, as I mentioned before, someone who previously grew up in a very evangelical place. And I mean, it becomes part of who you are, right? And that's all the education you want. I mean, I went to a Christian university, and that's something that you don't see in a lot of European countries, and they're thriving right now. It's called the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities in the United States, and there's 200 or 300 members, and they have, I mean, there's the strong academics that happen, and then I'm not trying to trash everything that they're doing, but you are required to take Bible classes and politics classes that give you a singular identity and point of view that I think is not occurring in other places and is unique to the American system, and really interesting. So to your question, what was the question? Because I do want to answer that.
Yeah, it was whether Trump, how has he changed American politics?
I mean, I think
attitudes.
Yeah, attitudes. I mean, I think it's just continued cynicism, right? That we've already seen this, but it's trending more towards cynicism. Polarization, I think, is through the roof. We were already, the cracks were there sort of during the Tea Party. You started to see that extreme polarization, and now it's just gotten greater to where you're the enemy, right? If you're not of my party, you are the enemy, and you're trying to take away my rights and my democracy. I mean, I live in Idaho, which is the 4th deepest red state. There are people every single day with their AK-47s and their Make America Great Again hats, just patrolling, just letting us know. And every Saturday they go around downtown Boise, which is the liberal part of the state, in their Trump caravans, and they let you know, and they yell at you on the street, not doing anything. So I think that there's extreme polarization and cynicism that was probably there before Trump, but it's been exposed.
Well, there's something more critical than that, and you're exactly right, Brooke, but it's that in order for my side to win, your side has to lose. So it's so much deeper than we are all in this together, we have differing views, and we're going to work this out. And I think we're seeing it globally. You know, in order for the Tories to win, the Labor has to lose, or for Labor to win, the Tories have to lose, and painfully so. There has to be, it's this us versus them mentality, but there are people supporting the current president of the United States who simply want, this is literally a slogan, make the liberals cry again. And on the other side, it's like, well, I don't care who wins, we just have to defeat Trump in some sort of moral, imperative way. And this leads to authoritarian governments, whether extreme left or extreme right wing, and we see that in history. Just look at the way the New York Times covered the rise of Adolf Hitler. It was covered in a way that was enabling, because it was covered like a regular news story instead of, an impending doom for Germany and Europe. And so I think we have to, figure out a way to fit into that, to say, okay, this isn't a rainstorm, it's a hurricane. And how does that affect the way we cover what's going on?
You'll remember too, though, when Trump first came on the scene, there were, I'm trying to remember what newspaper it was, but they were covering him on the entertainment pages. His initial run wasn't taken seriously. And so I think that has continued on that's kind of like the foundation in terms of his presidency, that we didn't take him seriously at first. I honestly, I think that was a miscalculation on the part of those outlets, those news outlets. And if I can just say, and then I will be quiet, Brooke, I wanted to say something when you mentioned about the religious reporting, because I think that's really important. But I also think it's important too to distinguish white evangelicals from Black evangelicals. I grew up in an apostolic church. And when I hear evangelical, because I had some of those same, I'm sure, upbringing, I was exposed to some of the same things, my upbringing, but my experience as an African-American evangelical would be very different than a white evangelical. And when the reporting is done, it's just kind of thrown out there as evangelical with I guess the default being, of course, the person is Black. I'm sorry, the person is white. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Brooke, do you want to jump in there?
Oh, I just wanted to agree completely with what she said. And that just goes to the fact there's no nuance. There's very little reporting on it generally. And then there's just absolutely no nuance to it. So.
We've got a couple of questions actually from some of my students, which of course I'm going to use the privilege of the chair. And then a really good question from Leslie Viney. And I think probably then we possibly need to call it a day. I'm very conscious of everyone's time. So John Murray, you've got a question you want to ask, John?
Yeah, I just wanted to let Brooke know that there was a documentary on the BBC called The Trump Show, and it had a great piece, about a 10-minute segment, was all about evangelical Trump using Paula White and the evangelical vote, and there was a 10-minute segment on that. It was a brilliant documentary. And it went on to show how Trump has really just got rid of all the experts in America. He's got rid of the experts that deal with the pandemic, security, race relations. And I just wanted to ask the panel if they thought there was any way that the experts could fight back.
Who wants to take that tough question? Nobody? Oh, that's obviously.
Well, no one wants to be quoted on social media and for their journalistic integrity. No, it's a really good question. There's this is, I think, uniquely American, at least so far as the Christian faith. And by the way, I'm a Catholic. I'm the youngest of 9 children with the name Brendan Patrick O'Keefe, probably Irish, right? So I do get to keep my EU passport, which is awesome. But that's another story. Sorry, I know that's a sore subject. But there's a conflation between the Christian faith and patriotism in the United States that is deeply disturbing because and I'm saying that as a faithful Catholic, because the country was founded on religious freedom, which includes freedom from a state-sponsored religion. It's in the First Amendment, along with press and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances and the freedom to assemble. These are the basic freedoms of the First Amendment. But so there's a large group of a plurality of Americans who consider, at least conceptually, the U.S. Constitution and the New Testament of the Bible are contemporary documents and are somehow intertwined. And I think that's really dangerous because then there's this sense of patriotism is dogma and dogma is patriotism. And then you have these religious litmus tests for officials and Supreme Court justices and this kind of thing. So how do you combat that? Well, faith and truth are two different things. Faith is the belief in something that cannot be proven. And so then that becomes very difficult because then it pits science against faith when, that they're not necessarily they don't necessarily have to be in conflict. You can believe in science and believe in God. But now it's become this false choice, and some people have chosen to completely disbelieve and distrust science. And so then when you say, back to your question, what do we do with the experts? Well, if people discount what an expert says simply because they've spent their entire career studying that subject, and this is where we have failed. And I've spoken on this several times, that we have elevated opinion in journalism, particularly in broadcast journalism. We have elevated opinion to be on equal footing with fact. We've elevated an opinion from a random person on the street to be equivalent to that of someone who has spent their entire career producing peer-reviewed scientific journals on a topic. So Bob from Boise, no offense to Boise, I'm just using that as an alliteration. Sorry about that, Brooke. So, Ted from Tampa, no offense, Ted, is put on equal footing with a climate scientist who's, studied for decades. And this is our fault because we've said, we want to hear from you, tweet us and send us your thoughts, and we'll share them on the news right next to the peer-reviewed journal. So now things that can be applied, you can apply the scientific method to study certain things. Climate change, I know, is a loaded topic, but really anything, COVID, you can apply science. You can actually test a theory, see if it works, and then have other people replicate it. But that's put on the same footing now. Well, I don't believe in masks. Well, sneeze in the mask. Did it catch the snot? Then it's working. There's this, and you can't get through to these people when I post, hey, you should wear your mask, and here's a scientific peer-reviewed study saying you should do so. Their answer is, how much money are you getting from Big Pharma? Because we know this is just the getting us all ready for the vaccine that's going to include all of these things that are going to, give our children autism. And you're like, what? Yeah, you're getting a check from Big Pharma. They literally think I get a check from Big Pharma because I think they should wear a mask. It's very difficult to put the job away at the end of the day because of that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Good point. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Jack Ewing, you've got a question.
Hi, I think this actually leads on from the previous question. I wanted to ask the panel what role they think QAnon is having in this election, and is the media's reporting on QAnon proportionate to its potential influence on voters at this election?
Nobody wants to.
I'll weigh in on I live in a heavy QAnon state, so I will. But I'd love to know Brendan's perspective, reporting on it. I think here in a place like Idaho, where our lieutenant governor is a QAnon person and has tried multiple times to impeach our governor, and everybody's Republican. It's a super majority here, but it's sort of now how Republican or QAnon, right? I think it's a large problem, but you have the same issue that you have with Trump's lies, which is you're also amplifying the conspiracy while you're trying to report on the people that are following the conspiracy. So generally, I'll say the local media here, the local and state media, have generally not reported on it. Is sort of how they're taking it. I don't know if we have an answer to the best way to go about reporting it, but it is a serious issue, and especially because in many states, gun laws are very liberal in terms of anyone can have them anywhere and do anything. It can be very scary at times because these beliefs are very, very extreme. But I'd love to hear Brendan weigh in on trying to cover it.
Well, I've already talked too much, so I apologize. I'll keep this short. So it's interesting. You say the local media hasn't covered it, but I bet you they have, and they don't even realize it, because QAnon has very successfully co-opted the Save the Children hashtag. They hold marches every weekend in our area, in one community or another, about child sex trafficking. And so it's really a thinly veiled presentation of QAnon, which believes, and this is not my opinion, this is borne out by factual reporting, they believe that there's this cabal of Democratic politicians who literally eat children's brains and their blood to gain sustenance, and that they're a pedophile ring, and they've got children trapped all over America that need to be liberated. And, most infamously, the Comet Ping Pong Pizza, the guy shows up with an M16 or an AR-15 and fires a round into into the pizza shop, believing there are children trapped in the basement when the building didn't even have a basement. I mean, it's just like where do you begin? And the problem, though, is that this movement is immune from facts. So they have predicted many things that were these like, the guy standing in Piccadilly Circus that said the end is nigh, the end is near. And then he's like, the world's going to end tomorrow. And you come back the next day and he's still there saying it's tomorrow because tomorrow never comes. Well, it's kind of like that with QAnon, except there are very specific dates in their sort of theology or cosmology. And when these dates pass and the prediction doesn't come true, they still keep believing it. It's completely immune from any kind of fact. And so that's what we saw with most recently. Donald Trump was supposed to announce that Mike Pence was not going to be his running mate, and it was going to be John F. Kennedy Jr., who died in a plane crash in the 1990s. But the QAnon theory was that he was still alive and was going to take the stage and be his running mate. And of course, it didn't happen. But now no one's talking about that on QAnon anymore. So it's completely immune from this. We have this problem now where the guy at the end of the guy at the pub at the end of the the end of the bar who's sort of spouting nonsense. I hate to use the phrase, but the village idiot that every village has, and the old saying is, if you don't know who the village idiot is, it's you. But it used to be that the village would kind of, moderate that person because it's like, this is crazy talk. Well, now there's a location on the internet where all of the village idiots can get together. I'm not saying that's what QAnon is. I'm saying there's a place if you have extreme or outrageous views where you can find people just like you who are going to echo and amplify that. And I think that that's one of the dangers of, this extraordinary invention of the internet. It's so much bigger than Gutenberg and the printing press because you don't have to own a printing press to get on the internet now. And the more extreme your view, the more likely it's going to be shared. And so there's this entropy of it where it's just constantly moving toward a more extreme, perspective.
Okay, but Brendan, let me just add this because I know, Margaret, you want to close. Yeah. But isn't there someone in Georgia who's a QAnon member who is running for office and probably will get into Congress? And see, I think that's where it gets scary.
Marjorie Taylor Greene. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene will be, I call her representative because she's a candidate, but she will be the equivalent of a member of parliament. She will be a member of Congress because her opponent, first off, she was in a gerrymandered district where basically there's no way that anybody but a Republican could win. So once she won the primary, she was all but guaranteed election. And then her opponent dropped out of the race mysteriously. So she's basically running unopposed and people would have to write in another name. So she will be a member of Congress and she has shared on social media some of these outrageous things. But the House of Representatives is a representative government. And if there's a large portion of people who believe this, there's the challenge of a democratic republic. If a plurality of Americans believe this, should they have representation in the House of Representatives?
But it's like, how do you report that? I mean, that's what we were talking about. You're almost forced to report it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And there's the problem. There's the rub, right?
I'm very conscious of the time and particularly of our speakers' time, and you've given of it so generously this afternoon. So thank you for that. Could I and thank you to everyone who's asked questions. I think some really great questions. Could I maybe ask one final question? Who do you think is going to win?
I don't bet.
That's a good answer, Karen. Brendan, Brooke.
Prediction is that 2020 has not disappointed so far and I don't think it will this time. And what I mean by that is there's an old saying, may you live in interesting times, which is even more important for journalists. Well, it's been a lifetime in 2020 and I have a feeling that 2020 isn't done with us yet. That's as far as I'll go.
Okay, I can perfectly understand where you're coming from. Brooke, do you want to pitch your hat into the ring, or are you just playing it safe too?
No, I mean, I feel, I guess we're all just going to have to feel this out right now, but I think it's going to be Biden-Harris, and I think we won't have the worst case scenario that we're all hoping for from everything that I read, and also living in a state that's so red, it's actually proving to be a little bit less red, and the states around us are, which I think is interesting. But all that to say, I don't know.
Yeah. So which could lead us into a really interesting conversation about the red wave and the blue wave and which one is going to be the biggest wave. And unfortunately, we just don't have time for that. I wish we did. We decided we would try and end with a little poll. Now, we've never done this before, but we're going to try it and see if it works and see what our audience think could win. So let's try this. And if it doesn't work, then we'll just call it a day. But here's your chance to vote. So if we give it maybe 30 seconds or something, and people can maybe click on who they think will win, and we will see what the AJE UK audience think the outcome is, and if it's actually more in hope than expectation. So we're almost at 100% of people voted, which is a pretty good turnout. And I think if we get 2 or 3 more people, we might get 100% turnout. I don't think we're getting everyone. So our vote is Joe Biden wins by 54%, Donald Trump on 15%, and too close to call 31%. So that was just, I don't know if that's an indication of what will actually happen next Tuesday. Can I please thank our speakers, Karen, Brooke, Brendan and Ted, who unfortunately has had to go. Can I thank you for really interesting contributions? I think it's been a really great event. Thank you so much for your time and for all the time I know that you've all put into preparing the presentations today. If you want to share them with us, we can share them with our members, and I think we would probably love to do that. Thank you so much to my colleagues from the AJE committee who've helped to keep today running pretty smoothly for an AJE event. And thank you so much to everyone who's attended today. It has been really interesting. I hope you've got something from it. I hope particularly for our students, you've got something that you can use in your coursework as you move forward. And I would say if there's anything I'm sure any of us can do to help you, please don't hesitate to contact us. So thank you so much. And we will maybe see you in 4 years' time, or maybe we will see you before that, who knows, for the next presidential election event. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
And we will see you again. We will be having an AJE event at the end of November on running remote news days, and we will share information with our members about that in the next few days.